March 7th, 1944. The skies over Rangoon trembled with the thunder of engines. At 20,000 feet, a formation of Japanese Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars sliced through the clouds like blades of silver, their wings glinting against the burning sun. Below them, a lone American bomber limped home, its fuselage trailing smoke, a dying bird over the jungles of Burma. Diving in from above, Japanese ace Major Saburo Sakai, his eyes sharp behind his goggles, lined up the kill. He had done this hundreds of times before, and the outcome seemed inevitable. He squeezed the trigger, cannon spitting fire. But before the bomber could fall, before Sakai could claim yet another victim, the sky itself seemed to rip open. From the horizon they came. A squadron of American P-51 Mustangs, their engines roaring with a metallic growl unlike anything the Japanese had ever faced. They moved fast, too fast, faster than the Oscars, faster than the vaunted Zeros. Within seconds, tracer fire carved the sky. The hunter became the hunted. Japanese pilots, men who had fought since Pearl Harbor, men trained to believe in their unmatched dominance of the air, suddenly found themselves prey. A Mustang dove from the sun, its 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns unleashing a storm. The air filled with the scream of tearing metal. A Japanese ace with over 20 kills to his name spiraled downward in a trail of black smoke. He never had the chance to react. The radio chatter in the Japanese formation erupted in panic. Aye, too fast. Too strong. The words echoed as one Mustang after another tore into the formation with ruthless precision. In the cockpits of those Japanese fighters, disbelief took root. For years, their aces had ruled the skies, carving legend after legend into the chronicles of war. In China, over Pearl Harbor, across the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, the rising sun had blazed in the heavens. The Zeros had been gods of the air, untouchable by sluggish American and British machines. But now, over Burma, something had changed. The Americans had brought a new predator. One designed not just to fight, but to dominate. The Mustang was not simply another fighter, it was a revelation. Cloud banks rolled like ghostly fortresses as the two forces clashed, machine guns hammering, tracers streaking across the heavens. A Japanese wingman tried to turn, pulling into a tight circle, the signature move of the Zero's supremacy. But the Mustang followed, climbing where no Japanese fighter could follow, its Packard-built Merlin engine roaring like a war drum. The Japanese ace banked desperately, his wings shuddering under the strain. But the Mustang pilot simply pulled higher, cut across the circle, and fired. A spray of bullets shredded the Japanese aircraft. The sky flared with flame. For the ground troops below, eyes turned upward, the battle was a storm of fire and steel. To the Americans on the ground, it was salvation. For the Japanese infantry, it was confusion. They had been told their air force was unbeatable, their samurai of the sky unmatched. And yet here, in the skies above Burma, the impossible was happening. Their best pilots, men with names whispered like legends, Tetsuzo Iwamoto, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Saburo Sakai, were falling, one by one, not to luck, not to overwhelming numbers, but to machines faster, stronger, deadlier than anything they had prepared for. The Mustangs were not just shooting down planes, they were dismantling myths. For the Japanese, air superiority was more than a military advantage. It was a weapon of morale, a psychological edge. Their fighters were built light, agile, designed for the dogfights of samurai duels in the sky. The Mustang rewrote the rules. It did not duel. It struck with speed, then vanished, only to return from another angle, like a hawk tearing apart sparrows. To the men who had once been gods of the air, it was unthinkable. To the Americans, it was a turning point. Engines screamed. Metal tore. Parachutes bloomed like white flowers against the dark canopy of the jungle below. Each falling Japanese pilot represented more than just a loss of manpower. It was the loss of invincibility, and for the men inside those Mustangs, many barely in their 20s, it was vindication. No longer would they look to the skies with dread, expecting Japanese fighters to descend from above. Now they were the hunters. The battle raged for less than 20 minutes, but in those minutes the balance of power shifted. By the time the smoke cleared, the Japanese had lost aces they could never replace. Training schools in Japan had already been cut down to shadows of their former selves. Fuel was scarce. Replacements rushed into battle with only the briefest instruction. Against the Mustang, even their veterans could not prevail. As the Mustangs circled, engines purring, the air seemed still. What had begun as another routine interception for the Japanese had turned into catastrophe. Survivors limped back to their bases, their cockpits silent, their spirits crushed. They could not understand how the Americans had leapt so far ahead, how a machine that should not exist could move as though born from the very wind. But the truth was simple and devastating. While Japanese engineers clung to the philosophy of maneuver and agility, the Americans had embraced speed, power, and range. The Mustang was the culmination of that vision, and its arrival marked the end of Japanese supremacy in the skies. From that day forward, every Japanese ace who took off knew the shadow of the Mustang might be waiting. The jungle swallowed the wreckage. Rivers carried away the oil that spilled from shattered engines. But in the minds of those who witnessed it, the day burned itself into memory. For the Japanese, it was the beginning of a nightmare. For the Americans, it was the day the tide turned, when the hunted became the hunters, and the skies of Asia shifted from the rising sun to the roaring wings of the Mustang. Word spread quickly through squadrons across the Pacific. Stories of invincible aces cut down in moments. Whispers of a new fighter, sleek, fast, invulnerable. The Japanese called it impossible. The Americans called it the Mustang. And as the sun set over Burma, the sky stained red with the smoke of burning aircraft. A realization settled in. The age of Japanese dominance was over. A new chapter in aerial warfare had begun, written not by the legends of the past, but by the steel-winged predator that now owned the skies. By 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched like a crimson tide across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. From the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor to the jungles of the Philippines, from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies to the mountain passes of Burma, the rising sun seemed unstoppable. The Japanese Air Arm had carved its legend into the skies with a single machine, the Mitsubishi A6M-0. Light, agile, almost supernatural in its ability to outturn and outclimb its foes, the Zero and its pilots were feared, respected, and in many places believed invincible. To Allied soldiers, staring upward as those silhouettes swooped down out of the clouds, the Zero was more than a fighter. It was a phantom of inevitability. But by late 1943, the tide had begun to shift. The grinding campaigns in Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands had taken their toll on Japanese air superiority. Their finest aces, men like Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and Tetsuzo Iwamoto, still prowled the skies, but the pools of fuel and fresh pilots were dwindling. For Japan, every lost veteran was irreplaceable. Meanwhile, the United States was awakening. Its industry, once slumbering in the shadows of neutrality, now roared with the sound of assembly lines. Factories in Detroit, Inglewood, and Dallas churned out machines of war in numbers the Axis powers could scarcely imagine. It wasn't just production, it was evolution. The Allies had learned bitter lessons in the early years of the war. They had sent up Brewster Buffaloes, Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, and early British Hurricanes, only to see them shredded in combat. The Zero's dominance was not only technical, but psychological. Pilots went to battle knowing they were flying inferior machines. And yet, as the campaigns dragged on, something began to change. The Americans adapted. Tactics shifted. The boom and zoom method, dive, strike, climb, and disengage, began to counter the Zero's dogfighting superiority. Slowly, painfully, the Allies were clawing back the sky, but adaptation alone would not win the war. What was needed was a revolution. A machine not merely equal to the Japanese fighters, but superior in every way: speed, range, firepower. A machine that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, protect the lifeline of supply routes, and strike fear into even the most seasoned ace. That machine was born not in Tokyo, not in Berlin, but in a quiet design office in Britain, then perfected in the factories of America. The North American P-51 Mustang. When it first appeared, even the Americans did not realize what they had. Early models, underpowered with Allison engines, struggled at high altitudes. But then came a marriage that would alter the war. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, a British engine born in the skies over the Battle of Britain, was fitted into the Mustang's sleek fuselage. The result was astonishing. At 30,000 feet, where bombers flew and Japanese interceptors hunted, the P-51 became untouchable. With a top speed of over 440 miles per hour, armed with 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, and capable of escorting bombers for over 1,500 miles, the Mustang was not just another fighter. It was an apex predator. By early 1944, Mustangs were arriving in squadrons across the China-Burma-India theater in the Pacific. To the Japanese aces who had ruled the skies since 1937, their arrival was a shock. For years, Japanese doctrine had emphasized agility, close-range dogfighting, the duel of maneuver, but the Mustang refused to duel. It struck like lightning, using speed and altitude to dictate every engagement. To the Japanese, it was as though the rules of the game had been rewritten. The skies of Burma became a testing ground for this new weapon. Japanese command believed their veterans, honed through years of relentless combat, could adapt. But each clash told a different story. Aces, who had once scored kills with ease, now found themselves outpaced, outgunned, outflown. The Mustang's speed meant the Japanese could no longer rely on their signature tactic, the sudden diving ambush. By the time they spotted a Mustang, the American was already behind them. Strategically, the impact was devastating. Japanese convoys, once protected by swarms of fighters, now found themselves exposed. Bombers that had once been easy prey for Zeros now thundered deep into Japanese-held territory with Mustang Guardians at their side. Oil depots, supply lines, and airfields, lifelines of the Japanese war machine, were struck with increasing ferocity. And with every battle, Japan's pool of irreplaceable veterans shrank further. Psychologically, the effect was even greater. Japanese pilots had been raised on the doctrine of invincibility, told that their skill, training, and honor made them unmatched. The fall of that myth was not just a tactical shift, it was a cultural earthquake. To see their best men, their legendary aces, shot from the sky by American pilots who were often younger, less experienced, but flying superior machines, this was a blow that reverberated from the cockpits to the halls of command in Tokyo. And for the Americans, the Mustang was more than just a machine. It was a symbol. For the ground troops slogging through jungles, for the sailors staring up from their convoys, the sight of a Mustang overhead meant safety, meant dominance, meant that the tide of war was turning. The whispers began, "The Mustang owns the sky." By mid-1944, the pattern was undeniable. Wherever Mustangs flew, Japanese losses mounted. From Rangoon to Saipan, from Formosa to the Philippines, the skies that once belonged to the rising sun now trembled under the roar of the Mustang's Merlin engine. The Zero, once the master of the Pacific, was suddenly prey. The transformation was as swift as it was total. The stage was set. The myths had been broken. The balance of air power had shifted. And as the Japanese aces prepared to face this new reality, they would soon discover that the Mustang was not just another fighter to be outmaneuvered. It was the harbinger of a new kind of warfare, one they could neither outfight nor outlast. The hunters had become the hunted. And the legend of invincibility, carved in fire across the early years of the Pacific War, was about to be shattered piece by piece in the smoke of burning aircraft, in the echo of a new sound in the skies, the thunder of the Mustang. The secret was not written in blood or glory, but in engineering. For years, the Japanese aces had believed their supremacy lay in the spirit of the samurai and the agility of their machines. They trusted the Zero's turn radius, the Oscar's nimbleness, and the lightning reflexes of men raised on the creed of Bushido. But war had shifted. The Americans had unlocked something Japan had not anticipated, a hidden advantage concealed beneath polished aluminum skins and within the heart of a single roaring engine. The Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin. When British engineers first designed the Merlin, it was a lifeline, a weapon to keep Spitfires aloft against the swarming Luftwaffe. But when that same engine was transplanted into the Mustang's fuselage, something extraordinary was born. Suddenly, the aircraft that had once been dismissed as underpowered transformed into the most formidable long-range fighter of the war. Its secret lay not just in raw speed, but in how it rewrote the entire grammar of air combat. The Japanese had built their air doctrine on the knife fight, the turning duel, the close-range clash where agility and pilot instinct meant survival. In those duels, the Zero was king. Its light frame, its unmatched maneuverability, and the courage of its pilots had made it invincible in the skies of 1941. But the Mustang didn't duel. It refused to fight by the old rules. It struck from above with speed that seemed unnatural, and then it vanished into the clouds, climbing where Japanese engines gasped for oxygen. The secret weapon was not only the Merlin, but also the philosophy behind the design. American engineers had asked themselves not how to turn tighter, but how to fly faster, longer, higher. The Mustang carried drop tanks that stretched its reach far beyond what Japanese fighters could dream of. It could escort bombers all the way from India into Burma, from the Marianas to the heart of the Philippines. Where the Japanese relied on scattered island bases, the Mustang leapt across oceans. For the Japanese aces, the first encounters with Mustangs were more than defeats. They were revelations of vulnerability. Veterans like Nishizawa, who had once scored kill after kill against slower, less coordinated American fighters, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy they could not outfly. A Mustang could dive at nearly 600 miles per hour, leaving the lightweight Japanese planes shuddering and stalling if they tried to follow. When the Zero attempted its trademark climbing turn, the Mustang simply powered higher, its supercharged Merlin laughing in the thin air. The hidden advantage extended beyond speed and altitude. Firepower. 6 Browning, 50 caliber M2 machine guns mounted in the wings, each capable of spitting 800 rounds per minute. A single burst from a Mustang could shred a Japanese fighter in seconds, slicing through its unarmored fuselage and self-sealing fuel tanks. Japanese planes, built for agility, were paper-thin compared to the Mustang's armored cockpit and robust frame. What had once been a duel of equals turned into an execution, and then there was coordination. American pilots, often underestimated as green and inexperienced, flew with a weapon invisible to the naked eye: radios. Clear, powerful, static-free communications. While Japanese pilots fought as lone wolves, relying on instinct and hand signals, Mustang squadrons fought as packs. They hunted like wolves, sharing information, flanking, trapping, and overwhelming their prey. To Japanese aces who had long believed in the individual warrior, it was bewildering. How could young Americans, untested in the fires of China or the Philippines, suddenly fly with such unity, such precision? The answer was hidden advantage layered upon hidden advantage: radios, drop tanks. Armored cockpits, firepower, speed, and above all the engine. The Mustang was the ultimate expression of industrial warfare. An aircraft not just for duels, but for campaigns, for strategy, for empire. On the ground, intelligence officers began receiving reports. Japanese pilots, stunned and shaken, described ghost planes that could not be caught. They climb into the heavens, one report read, and return with thunder. Others wrote of their helplessness as Mustangs cut through entire formations before vanishing into the sun. The disbelief was not only tactical, but spiritual. These were the men who had grown up with the myth of the invincible zero. To admit defeat was to question everything. But the truth was inescapable. The Americans had leapt ahead, not by outdueling, but by outthinking. The Mustang was not merely a fighter, it was a system. A machine built to exploit every weakness the Japanese had ignored, every blind spot in their doctrine. The Zero was born for offense, not defense. The Mustang was built for total war. In the cockpits of Japan's finest, disbelief turned to dread. Every sortie became a gamble. Even the best pilots, men with hundreds of kills, began to whisper among themselves. How could they prevail when their machines were slower, weaker, and less protected? How could spirit alone withstand the storm of technology? For the Americans, the hidden advantage was more than mechanical. It was psychological. Young men who had once feared the Zeros now flew with confidence. They knew their Mustangs could protect them, could outrun, outfight, and outlast their enemy. The fear that had haunted the early days of the Pacific War began to evaporate. In its place came determination, and with determination came dominance. The hidden advantage had been revealed, but for the Japanese it was already too late. They were locked into an air war they could not win, fighting with machines designed for an era that had passed. The Mustang represented the future, and with every battle, that future became the present. The skies that had once echoed with the proud roar of Japanese fighters now trembled with a new sound, the deep, unrelenting growl of the Merlin engine. It was not just a machine, it was a promise. A promise that the era of Japanese supremacy was over, and that the hunters had finally arrived. The P-51 Mustang was more than just a silhouette against the clouds. It was a masterpiece of design, a fusion of elegance and lethality. To understand why Japanese aces fell before it, one must peel back the skin of aluminum and look into the heart of the machine. This was not merely an aircraft. It was an engineering revolution. The numbers themselves spoke with cold authority. The Mustang, powered by the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin Vi 1657, could reach speeds of 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Its service ceiling climbed to over 41,000 feet, a domain where Japanese fighters like the Zero and the Oscar began to suffocate. The Mustang could travel more than 650 miles with drop tanks, unheard of range in 1944. It was the first Allied fighter that could escort bombers all the way from distant bases into the heart of enemy territory and still fight when it arrived. In the Pacific, where distances swallowed entire fleets, this was nothing short of revolutionary. Its weaponry was designed not for warning shots or fleeting duels, but for destruction. 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing, could unleash 7,200 rounds per minute combined. Each slug, nearly half an inch thick, tore through steel, fuel, and flesh with brutal efficiency. A burst from a Mustang didn't merely damage, it annihilated. Japanese aircraft, with their lightly built frames and unarmored cockpits, were shredded in seconds. In after-action reports, American pilots often noted how 1 or 2 short bursts were enough to reduce an enemy fighter to flaming wreckage. The engineering brilliance extended beyond sheer firepower. The Mustang's laminar flow wing design was a triumph of aerodynamics, reducing drag and allowing the fighter to slice through the air with minimal resistance. The long, sleek fuselage concealed a fuselage tank behind the pilot, extending range but requiring careful handling until it was emptied. The bubble canopy, introduced in the later P-51D models, gave pilots unprecedented visibility, a critical advantage in the chaos of dogfights. By contrast, Japanese cockpits were cramped, framed, and blind in crucial directions, forcing their pilots to rely on instinct rather than sight. Protection was another hidden strength. Mustang cockpits were armored. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing. The aircraft could take hits, absorb punishment, and still bring its pilot home. Japanese fighters, in pursuit of agility, had sacrificed all such protection. A single burst from a Mustang often ignited Japanese fuel tanks, and the pilot's fate was sealed in fire. In Japanese culture, this vulnerability was sometimes masked under the romantic veil of sacrifice, but in the cold calculus of war, it meant irreplaceable losses. Production numbers told another story. North American Aviation, operating at full wartime tempo, built nearly 15,000 Mustangs between 1941 and 1945. Assembly lines in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas turned out aircraft at a pace Japan could not hope to match. Japanese factories, starved of aluminum, crippled by Allied bombing, and lacking fuel to train new pilots, managed only a fraction of that output. Even when they introduced newer fighters like the Kawanishi N1K2J Shiden or the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden, they appeared in too few numbers, too late, and with too little fuel for adequate training. Behind every Mustang stood an army of workers. In Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles, men and women riveted wings, wired radios, and tested engines with the urgency of a nation mobilized. At Packard's plant in Ohio, Merlin engines were produced under license, rolling off lines with precision that astounded British engineers. The scale of American industry was as much a weapon as the Mustang itself. Each engine, each fuselage, each crate of .50 caliber ammunition represented a tide of war Japan could not resist. Even the details whispered of superiority. The Mustang's SCR 522 radio gave pilots clear, reliable communication across squadrons, allowing coordinated attacks and swift responses. Japanese pilots, still relying on weaker transmitters and sometimes even hand signals, were often isolated in combat. While one Japanese ace fought desperately alone, Mustang pilots moved like a school of predators, sharing vision, surrounding, striking. The cockpit layout, too, was designed with thought. Gauges were logically arranged, controls accessible even in the chaos of battle. Japanese aircraft often forced pilots to manage a tangle of levers and instruments, a burden in moments where seconds meant survival. The Mustang pilot, by contrast, flew a machine that felt almost intuitive, a design shaped not only by engineers, but by feedback from the men who risked their lives in it. To the Japanese, these details were invisible until too late. What they saw was the outcome, a plane that appeared from above, struck with impossible speed, and then climbed beyond reach. Reports began to filter back to Japanese command, descriptions of devilish machines that could fly faster than any Oscar, climb higher than any Zero, and endure punishment that would have destroyed a Japanese fighter 10 times over. And yet, beyond all the numbers, beyond all the engineering, there was something more elusive, the aura. Pilots described the Mustang as if it had a spirit of its own. It was smooth, responsive, a predator in the air. American flyers loved it, trusted it, felt invincible in it. For Japanese pilots, the encounter was the opposite, dread. To meet a Mustang in combat was to sense inevitability, as if the battle had been decided before the first burst of fire. The Mustang was not just an aircraft. It was the embodiment of America's war machine. Speed, firepower, range, and numbers, all combined into a single weapon. It was the proof that technology and industry could break the myths of individual heroism. Against it, the samurai spirit faltered. By the time the Mustang reached full deployment, it was no longer a question of whether Japanese aces could outfly it. The question was how long Japan could endure against a machine designed to win not one duel, but the entire war. The answer, written in burning wrecks across the Pacific, was clear. September 12, 1944. The skies over central Burma were heavy with humidity, the monsoon rains leaving the ground below a steaming jungle carpet. Allied bombers, lumbering giants of the air, droned eastward on a mission to cripple Japanese supply depots near Mandalay. For the Japanese, intercepting such raids was a point of pride as much as necessity. Their veterans had spent years claiming bombers as trophies, swooping from the sun, carving through formations, and sending the wreckage spiraling into the green abyss below. On this day, a squadron of Kai-84 Hayates, the vaunted Frank, one of Japan's newest fighters, rose to meet them. Among their ranks were men who had once flown Zeros in the glory days of 1941, aces with kill tallies etched into the very fabric of their legend. Their orders were clear: stop the bombers at all costs. Yet what none of them knew was that escorting this raid, gliding silently above the clouds, was a formation of Mustangs. Their engines purred like lions waiting for the kill. At 24,000 feet, the Japanese struck first. Diving into the bomber formation, cannons blazing, they expected to repeat the rituals of earlier victories. But in the blink of an eye, their roles reversed. Mustangs, with their altitude advantage and blistering speed, fell upon them like hawks striking doves. 6 Brownings roared in unison, lines of tracer fire slicing the sky into ribbons of death. One Japanese ace, credited with more than 30 kills, pulled into a climbing spiral, a maneuver that would have left earlier American fighters stalling and helpless. But the Mustang followed effortlessly, its Merlin engine breathing power into the thin air where Japanese engines gasped. The Hayate shuddered, the Mustang did not. A burst of fire chewed through the Japanese plane, flames erupting from the engine cowling. The ace never had a chance to eject. The battle became chaos. Radios crackled in the Mustang cockpits, American voices coordinating, vectoring, flanking. Break left, I've got your 6. 2 bogies climbing at 2 o'clock. Information flowed like electricity through the pack. The Japanese, by contrast, fought as individuals. Wingmen scattered, each ace relying on instinct and personal skill, unaware of the trap forming around them. From below, soldiers on both sides gazed upward at the storm. The bombers thundered on, barely scratched, while the escorts turned the sky into a graveyard. In less than 20 minutes, 8 Japanese fighters were torn from the heavens. Some fell in spirals, leaving black trails that cut across the clouds. Others exploded outright, debris raining into the jungle canopy. The Mustangs, by contrast, lost only one of their number, its pilot bailing out safely to be retrieved by Allied forces. After-action reports from the Japanese side were grim. Surviving pilots described an enemy faster than the storm, stronger than the wind. One wrote in disbelief, "Their aircraft climbs as though pulled by the gods. Even when we dive, they are already behind us." intelligence officers in Rangoon struggled to comprehend. The Allies had once been clumsy in the air, their machines outmatched. Now, their fighters dictated every engagement. The Japanese had no answer. The Arakan campaign later that year confirmed the pattern. Over the rice fields and mangrove swamps, Mustangs became executioners. Japanese units scrambled to intercept Allied supply flights, but the Mustangs were always there, invisible until the ambush, merciless in the strike. The Japanese lost not just machines, but the irreplaceable men inside them, the veterans who had survived since China, the aces who had taught entire generations of pilots. Each loss was more than tactical. It was cultural erosion, the crumbling of a myth that had sustained their war effort. Perhaps the most telling moment came at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, where Japanese pilots, already strained by dwindling resources, faced Mustangs and Hellcats in overwhelming numbers. The Zeros still flew with bravery, but bravery could not outfly a bullet. Reports filtered back to Tokyo of aces being picked off before they could even close with the enemy. The air superiority once promised to the Imperial Army was evaporating. The Germans, too, had felt this sting. At Aracourt in France that same autumn, Mustangs tore into Panthers and Stukas alike, proving their worth in another theater. But for the Japanese, the shock was sharper. They had believed their doctrine of agility and honor would outlast brute force. Yet here was proof that industry, range, and coordination could shatter even the most disciplined warrior. The kill ratios told the story without poetry. In Burma, American squadrons flying Mustangs reported losses of 1 plane for every 6 to 8 Japanese destroyed. In the Philippines, the numbers climbed higher. In China, Japanese commanders admitted in private that their pilots were dying faster than they could be trained. The Mustang was not just a fighter, it was a scythe, cutting down the dwindling fields of Japanese air power. Even so, Japanese pilots fought on with grim determination. They still climbed into cockpits, still painted symbols of victory beneath their canopies, still whispered prayers before takeoff. But inside, the fear was growing. They had once been the hunters of the Pacific. Now, every mission carried the shadow of a Mustang above the clouds, waiting, patient, inevitable. When the dust settled after Burma, the shockwaves rippled across the empire. The generals in Tokyo could no longer promise their men that the skies belonged to the rising sun. And for the Americans, it was a validation. The Mustang had proven itself not in test flights or specifications, but in blood and fire. It had broken the legend of Japanese invincibility, not with speeches or promises, but with kill after kill written in smoke against the wide, endless sky. The message was clear. The Mustang was not merely a participant in the air war. It was its master. And from Mandalay to Manila, every Japanese pilot now took off with the knowledge that somewhere, unseen and unheard, the hunter was waiting. For the Japanese, the loss of air superiority was not simply measured in wreckage scattered across jungles and seas. It was measured in morale, in the collapse of a belief that had carried them since the opening strikes of the war. When the first waves of Zeros had clawed the sky at Pearl Harbor, when Oscars had shredded Allied aircraft in the early Burma campaigns, the message had been clear. Japan ruled the heavens. Pilots were warriors of a new samurai order, aces who embodied the Empire's invincibility. But the Mustang changed everything. Strategically, its arrival was a knife in the Empire's heart. The long-range escort that Tokyo had dismissed as impossible was now a reality. Bombers once easy prey now thundered over Rangoon, Manila, and Formosa with P-51 Guardians circling above them. Every fuel depot, every convoy, every airfield that Japan relied upon was suddenly exposed. There was no safe haven, no sanctuary. The skies, once Japan's shield, became America's weapon. The impact rippled across campaigns. In Burma, Japanese ground forces had relied on the Imperial Army Air Service to keep Allied supply routes threatened. With Mustangs prowling overhead, that threat evaporated. In the Philippines, General MacArthur's return was paved not only by naval guns and infantry assaults, but by squadrons of Mustangs clearing the air with ruthless efficiency. In China, the Mustang became the spearhead of the 14th Air Force, striking deep into Japanese supply lines and forcing enemy pilots into battles they could not win. But beyond the statistics of destroyed planes and bombed convoys was something deeper, the psychological fracture. Japanese pilots had been raised on a creed of superiority. They were told from their first day of training that the Zero was unmatched, that the warrior spirit would always triumph over material power. They had believed it because in 1941 and 1942 it had seemed true. But by 1944, as Mustangs carved through their ranks, that creed turned into a burden. Aces who once returned to their bases with pride now landed with silence in their cockpits, their squadrons reduced, their faith shaken. Reports from American intelligence intercepted the shift. Prisoners of war spoke of fear, of disbelief, of watching legends fall. And one Japanese pilot confessed, "We thought our planes were the best in the world. But now, every time we take off, we pray we do not meet the Mustang." It was not only a tactical defeat, it was cultural humiliation. For the Americans, the psychological tide ran the other way. In 1942, Green pilots had climbed into cockpits with dread, knowing the enemy above them flew superior machines. By 1944, the fear was gone. The Mustang gave them confidence, the sense that they could not only survive, but dominate. In cockpit recordings, young pilots barely past their teens spoke with calm authority, calling maneuvers, sharing targets, speaking the language of men who knew the sky belonged to them. Confidence bred aggression, and aggression brought results. On the ground, soldiers felt it too. Infantrymen slogging through jungles or sailors standing watch on decks looked up at the contrails overhead and knew which way the war was turning. To see Zeros once meant danger. To see Mustangs meant protection. The difference was not just tactical, but emotional. The Mustang became a symbol of American ascendancy, as iconic in its own way as the Sherman tank or the Liberty ship. For Japanese ground forces, the opposite was true. Reports of air support dwindled. The sight of burning Zeros falling from the sky was demoralizing. Where once they had trusted their aces to clear the air, they now looked up with dread, knowing that American fighters owned the heavens. The psychological toll was devastating, eroding the fighting spirit of men already stretched by hunger, disease, and retreat. The strategic consequences were staggering. Without control of the air, Japanese offensives stalled. Supply convoys were shredded before they could reach frontline troops. Bombers pounded cities and factories with impunity. The Empire's vast holdings, stretched across thousands of miles, suddenly became a liability rather than a strength. The Mustang turned geography into a weapon, making vast distances a trap rather than a shield. Even at the highest levels of command, the realization was unavoidable. Japanese officers, once arrogant in their certainty of aerial supremacy, began to whisper of the devil's fighter. The Mustang was described in reports as a machine that could not be matched, an enemy that rendered strategy meaningless. And, with each loss, the truth settled deeper. Japan could no longer control the sky. The psychological impact extended even to the aces themselves. Men, who had once been legends, celebrated in newspapers and propaganda, returned from missions visibly shaken. To lose in combat was acceptable. To be outclassed by a machine was something else entirely. Pride turned to despair. Confidence turned to fatalism. Some pilots, knowing they faced Mustangs, began to accept their deaths before even taking off. The rise of kamikaze tactics was in part a reflection of this. When survival seemed impossible, death became the only weapon left. The Americans, by contrast, harnessed their advantage to full effect. Radio communication meant that even when a squadron leader fell, the group remained united, coordinated, lethal. Japanese pilots, trained to follow their leaders plain visually, collapsed into confusion when command aircraft were destroyed. The Mustang turned that weakness into a weapon, cutting off the head and watching the body falter. The legacy of this psychological shift was profound. The war in the Pacific had been built on myths of the invincible Zero, of the unstoppable ace, of the empire destined to rule the skies. The Mustang shattered those myths one dogfight at a time, not with ideology, but with cold engineering and relentless strategy. It proved that spirit alone could not triumph against speed, firepower, and industry. By 1945, the Japanese pilots who once carried the pride of an empire into the sky now flew with resignation. Their aces, the best of the best, had been cut down, their replacements barely trained, their machines inferior. Above them, the Mustangs roared, their shadows stretching across the empire's last days. The strategic and psychological impact was complete. The Japanese could no longer believe in invincibility. The Americans could no longer doubt their dominance. And in that shift, the war itself tilted toward its inevitable conclusion. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the wreckage of Japanese aircraft still smoldered in jungles, rice fields, and island airstrips across the Pacific. What once had been the pride of an empire now lay scattered as twisted aluminum, silent testimony to a war that had devoured men and machines alike. Among the wrecks of Zeros, Oscars, and Franks, the lesson was unmistakable. Japanese aces, once the masters of the air, had been undone not by spirit or bravery, but by a machine that embodied a new age of warfare, the Mustang. The legacy of this transformation was profound. The Mustang had not only broken Japan's aerial supremacy, it had rewritten the very doctrine of modern air combat. It proved that range, speed, and coordination mattered more than turn radii or ritualized dogfighting. It proved that wars would be won not by individual warriors alone, but by systems, by machines supported by industry, strategy, and communication. Where the Zero symbolized the lone swordsman, the Mustang symbolized the army of the future, fighting as one organism across the sky. For Japan, the consequences were bitter. Their ace culture, once the pride of the nation, became a cautionary tale. Men like Nishizawa and Iwamoto had scored staggering tallies, but their victories could not overcome the tide of American production and innovation. Each time one fell to a Mustang's guns, it was as if a pillar of legend had been torn from beneath the empire. And when those aces were gone, there was no one to replace them. Japan's pilot schools, stripped of fuel and forced to graduate cadets after only a few hours of flight time, could not breed new masters. The result was inevitable. A generation of young men sent to their deaths against machines they could never hope to match. For America, the Mustang's story became one of pride and validation. It was not just another aircraft among many. It was the fighter that escorted bombers deep into Europe, crippling the Luftwaffe. It was the fighter that shattered Japanese air power across Burma, China, and the Philippines. It was the fighter that gave confidence to young American pilots, transforming fear into dominance. And in doing so, it became a symbol of a larger truth, that industrial might, when harnessed to innovation, could defeat even the most mythic adversary. The influence of the Mustang did not end with the war. Its DNA carried forward into the jet age, where range, coordination, and communications remained the backbone of aerial strategy. In the Cold War, American doctrine embraced the lessons of the P-51 that fighters must operate as networks, that superiority came not only from the individual pilot, but from the system that supported him. In Korea, Sabres carried those lessons against MiGs. In Vietnam, Phantoms echoed them still. And by the Gulf War, the very concept of network-centric warfare, the idea that victory depended on machines connected, communicating, supporting, was a direct descendant of the philosophy the Mustang had proven in 1944. Even the Japanese would come to acknowledge this truth. Captured reports, post-war interviews, and candid admissions revealed a sobering realization. They had built fighters for the duels of yesterday, while America had built for the campaigns of tomorrow. One Japanese officer admitted, "Our fighters were swords. Theirs were rifles." In the end, the rifle wins. The cultural memory of the Mustang became almost mythic in itself. Veterans spoke of the roar of the Merlin engine as the sound of salvation. To infantry pinned under Japanese fire, it was the angel overhead. To bomber crews, once hunted mercilessly by Zeros, it was the guardian in the clouds. To Japanese ground troops watching their own air force fall from the sky, it was the harbinger of defeat. And to the aces who faced it, the Mustang was the opponent they could never conquer, the shadow that haunted their final flights. But perhaps its greatest legacy was not measured in battles won or planes downed, but in the lesson it left for the world, that no myth is unbreakable, no supremacy eternal. The Zero had seemed invincible. Its pilots had been legends. Yet technology, industry, and adaptation had shattered that legend in less than 3 years. The Mustang was proof that in war, the future belongs to those who evolve, who build not only for today's fight, but for tomorrow's. As the decades passed, the image of the Mustang endured. Airshows kept its wings alive, its engine still growling across the skies it once ruled. Historians and veterans alike remembered it not only as a machine of war, but as a turning point in history. In its polished aluminum skin was written the truth of the Pacific Air War, that courage without tools is tragedy, and that innovation, when harnessed to will, can change the course of nations. In the end, the Mustang was more than a fighter plane. It was a symbol of transition, from myth to modernity, from individual heroism to industrial power, from the old ways of war to the new. Its shadow stretched far beyond the Pacific, echoing into every conflict that followed, every doctrine that shaped the modern battlefield. For the Japanese, it was the ghost that haunted their skies, the machine that no ace could outfly. For the Americans, it was the sword that cut through doubt and fear, carrying them from the dark days of early defeats to the triumph of victory. And for history, it remains the eternal reminder that in the skies above Burma, the Philippines, and beyond, the legend of invincibility fell, and a new truth rose on silver wings. The Mustang did not just shoot down planes, it shot down an empire's illusion. The lesson endures. In modern war, connection outweighs isolation, industry outweighs spirit, and speed, in the end, defeats armor.